Today has been a day of marathoning all of my filming, and I want to talk about The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. And yeah, I want to say this first by saying I've read a lot of his works. I've actually read so many of the stories that are in his head because I've read both of his short story collections, The Paper Menagerie and The Hidden Girl. And I definitely would say, and I say this in a Ken Liu gush fest on World Hoppers, which I definitely recommend you check out. It doesn't have any spoilers for any of his stories. You just get a really good sense of who he is as an author and why a bunch of us really appreciate what he does. And this is from people who have read the Dandelion Dynasty to the people who have just read short stories, like why he is appreciated as an author. I want you to check that video out. But here, we're going to talk about The Grace of Kings, which for very few people would I say this is your first book that you should read by Ken Liu, because I feel like it's definitely a project, and I'm used to him doing projects, but it's a very long one. It's a 600 plus page project. And I do think you need to have certain expectations going into it, because otherwise you might not have a great time. And I know I really appreciated having my expectations set before picking this book up. And now, what do I mean by that? We're going to start with narrative framing, because I do think that's where this story is going to be the most disjointed, at least for Western consumers. I actually think this probably is more similar to this telling of stories in Eastern culture, but for Western culture, this is very compartmentalized. It is very chunked into bits, and it's broader than it is deep in this story in terms of character work, and we span, I think, 15 to 20 years in these 600 pages. Like, we do a lot of time jumps. We're definitely coming in for important moments and leaving and having lots of time skips. And we have a large cast of characters we follow. There are main characters, but you will not be invested in these characters like you typically are in a lot of high epic fantasy books, especially ones that have political trappings like this. I do think there's a Venn diagram of people who like stuff like A Song of Ice and Fire, that type of political fantasy that is historically based with this, which this is historically based on, I'm forgetting which dynasty, but a Chinese dynasty. I'll have the name on the screen because I am now blanking on it, because now all I can think about is She Who Became the Sun. And I think that's inspired by the Ming Dynasty. And so you have that overlap, and I do know many people who are huge fans of A Song of Ice and Fire who really like the Dandelion Dynasty. So I think there is an overlap there. But at the same time, the people who really liked the I'm spending 30 pages per chapter with one character, you're not getting that in Grace of Kings. I think that changes with other books that I have not read yet. But with Grace of Kings, I ended up liking characters, really loving characters, rooting for them, being obsessed with certain character arcs, even though I only knew them for like 20 pages. But that's the thing, it was definitely a short story author getting me to know characters and doing it in a very efficient and quick way. That's just not going to land with everyone. It's just not. So you just have to know that going in, is that I think a lot of people say it has a distant approach. And I kind of see that. I just think in my head it's less about distance, because I did get really close to these characters. It's just you are literally just jumping in at certain points. It's very broad. I would say fragmented's another good word. You get a lot of chunks that get put together. Like, if you're someone who's used to that in Malazan Book of the Fallen, you would be used to that here, because that is another series where you maybe only get to spend like 10 pages with a character, but that character means a lot to you by the end of that book, if that makes sense. And so that is, I think, an expectation you should have up front. Now, something I do want to say that I think was scary for me, but wasn't as much because I read his short stories. So if you really are like, I'm starting with the Dandelion Dynasty, I am not reading his other short story works, he's a very accessible author in terms of his prose. He is very efficient in them. They flow very well. You will not be confused by what is happening on the page. You will not be confused by the sentence structure. The vocabulary is always spelled out if it's different than what you're used to. He writes in a way that you will know what is happening. Now, will you be able to keep track of all the names and the places, and will you know why you're watching the scene you're happening? That's a different thing. But in terms of density, the prose are not dense. They are not hard to read. And I think that's something I wish I had known going into it, because I think I was nervous because the only other works I'd really seen this compared to potentially is how it's distant in Lord of the Rings, which Fellowship of the Ring for me is written in a style that is not as modern and is really hard for me to read. It's just not as enjoyable for me as it is for a lot of people. This is a much more modern style, and I really enjoyed it. I had a really good time with it. So that's definitely stuff you want to know into it. Character work was something I mentioned. like I said, I have favorite characters. I had moments when I was vlogging this for my patrons where I'm like, I'm not looking forward to what must happen with these characters. Like, I mean, is there any universe in which this won't happen? And of course it did happen because, like, I've read fantasy, I've watched epics, and, like, I was so invested in that, like, even though I knew it would happen. And, like, my favorite character is the person who is the Dandelion of the Dandelion Dynasty. I thought his character work was so interesting. And I hope I get to know him more and that I don't suddenly stop liking him. Because another theme of this book was definitely power corrupts. And, yeah. Another thing, though, you need to know is I've already kind of talked about the scope of this story. That it's broader than it is deep, and, you know, we're spanning a bunch of years, we have a bunch of characters, we're on this vast kind of archipelago, and we're looking at different parts of this conflict, because we are going through changes in empire, we are transitioning rules, the Dandelion Dynasty, we're going from what was to what will be the Dandelion Dynasty. That is the scope of this first book. And because of that, it is very much a setup book. This is setting up the rest of the series, I feel. That's my prediction. Having read a lot of fantasy setup books in my day. It's a good book. It has its own arc of we started with one government and we end with a different government. That is the arc of the story. But in terms of catharsis and knowing where we're going next, like, I personally have many more questions that I hope will be answered with many more books, if that makes sense. So that's another thing, though, that's like, some people don't want to read 600 pages of a setup book, especially one that maybe doesn't give them the character connection that they usually want from a book that is that long. I did buddy read this with a friend, and for her, this book did not earn its length. That is the thing. It is a long fantasy book, and for how it is constructed, if it does not work for you, it might not be worth the time you put into it, and I believe this is the shortest book in the series, so that's just kind of how it is. But another thing I want to highlight is the world building. Oh my goodness, it's so fun. Oh, and I'm so excited because I think it's going to become even more fantastical. In this book, it is generally low magic, political, military, like fantasy, stuff like that. I almost say sci-fi because there's some really cool technology where you realize that, yes, Ken Liu is primarily a sci-fi author and gives me the explanations for the technology that I need. So fun. And there are really cool mythical creatures, but, like, there's also gods among men, which I was not prepared for, and they banter and they scheme, and that's my favorite thing. One of my favorite musicals of all time, Once on This Island, literally is that trope on steroids. Like, I love that. It was so fun seeing that in parallel. It's like, it'd be so funny. You would have scenes, you'd see the people doing stuff, and then the gods would just be, like, talking to the side and being like, oh, I see you couldn't stop being involved there, because there are technically rules where they can't get too involved. So I enjoyed that. There was a little spice to the whole story, how they pick sides and who they're rooting for, because, like I said, we are transitioning from one government to the other in this book. And that's not a smooth transition. We're not going A to B. There's a couple stops along the way. And so I really enjoyed it. I had a good time. It's not a favorite of all time, and I do think if it was a standalone, I would still appreciate it, but would have wanted a bit more. As it stands as, like, a first book in a series, I actually think it's a really good setup book. Sometimes you need a setup book, and I'm someone who's okay with that as a high epic fantasy reader. This is not the first or last time I will be given a really long setup book. But I do think it's a setup book that, in terms of the project the author wanted to do, is done spectacularly well. Like, I think he was mimicking a type of storytelling that we're not used to as Western readers, and it works really well. Like, I loved seeing this short story author write a really long epic fantasy novel, and I think he did a pretty good job. I am someone who, when I read someone who writes short stories, I'm always like, I don't think you wrote the novel quite as well, and vice versa. I don't think always people who write long form write short stories really well. They are different arts. And I think for this being his first one, the way he chose to focus on compartmentalization and making things into parts and, like, really utilizing the fact that a chapter can be a complete thought. I feel like a lot of authors don't do that as much anymore. They're just kind of like, well, we're changing scenes, I guess, right? Or maybe not. Like, it's kind of more like, you know, when you're watching movies and we're doing a little bit too many fade to blacks, like, we could have stayed there longer. I don't know if that analogy makes sense. But I really felt like every partition in the story was very intentional. Chapters were always as long as they needed to be. They never felt too long. And I really enjoyed the strategy. As someone who does not read a lot of military or political fantasy, at least that's not my choice, this book is a lot of my anti-buzzwords. And they worked really well for me. Like, I really enjoyed that. So, I don't know, hopefully that gives you an idea of if you should try this. And I will say, having not read the sequel book, Wall of Storms. I have heard from everyone, people who love Grace of Kings, people who gave Grace of Kings 3 stars, that Wall of Storms is one of the best books they've read all year. So if you've read Grace of Kings, I guess keep that in mind. Maybe I will also be one of those people who are shouting from the rooftops, just try Wall of Storms, it is so much better. But I do think, as its own project, Grace of Kings is actually a really great work of fantasy, and I'm really glad I read it because I both enjoyed it and appreciated what it did. So that's it for this video. If you've read it, feel free to chat with me about it in the comments, spoiler-free. Please, if you want to talk spoilers, come over to the Discord and we can chat over there. And if you want to just leave an emoji to let me know you're here, leave a flower. I don't think there's a dandelion, but flower imagery is really big in this book and I really appreciated it, so a flower. Otherwise, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.